My two favorite objects in the whole wide world are in two different museums in New York City. The first is an idol covered with dung. The dung is intentional, a kind of sacrificial paste, and it probably contains more than a smidgen of blood. The idol is a little bigger than a Barbie doll, and I probably looked at it 100 times. It's dark and mysterious and sinisterly frightening, and it makes me feel at least borderline transgressive. I read all about it, and it's still a conundrum, a thing that refuses to reveal itself right on the border of magic and religion. One day I'll try to tease all of this out and make sense of the parts that attract and repel. Right now, it feeds my appetite for magic. The other object on this list is equally mysterious, but on some level it carries a whiff of familiarity. About 8 inches across, it sits quietly in a corner among the ritual objects at the Jewish Museum. It's easily overwhelmed by the treasures around it, the arc curtains fashioned from velvet wedding dresses, those medieval wedding rings that look like little towers. But that bowl is something else entirely. Small and brown, it's an unglazed pot, a clay intruder in a world of pearls and damask. It's inscribed with a Hebrew and Aramaic text that spirals down from rim to base, and it was intended as both a shield and a sword. There's only one on display at the Jewish Museum, but there are dozens in collections all over the world. All were excavated in rural Iraq and represent a culture that is in some ways still with us. They are the so-called magic bowls of Nippur, and they were used for centuries by Jews and others for the purpose of defending themselves against evil and calling down harm on their mortal enemies. Made by artisans with a diverse clientele, they were clearly a part of Jewish daily life. Now, no one can describe the particulars, but like all magic, they are a window on the soul, revealing the things that we both want and fear. They open up the minds of people just like us and tell us what we cannot live without. The fact that they make reference to demons and the supernatural makes the anxiety of our ancestors vivid and real. Magic is not the opposite of Judaism. We are deeply drawn to its meaning and utility. That's true of magic both then and now. And I admit that I sometimes feel that acutely. The very last time was a gift from our friends, the Donaldsons. They saw something on Hulu and wanted me and Alice to see it. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Bob, for giving us the keys to something called In and of Itself. I hope that some of you saw it yourselves. Defining it precisely presses the limits of language. You'd be right to call it a kind of public memoir. Derek Delgado tells snippets from his life and meditates about the border between seams and reality. Everything is wrapped around a sequence of tricks that function as a kind of theatrical scaffold. Now, at first, they seem like nothing at all. He slips a paper boat into a bottle and lays it on a plinth of sand. He disappears a brick under a shelter of playing cards and makes it reappear far away on a corner in Manhattan. I couldn't perform either of these wonders, but they fall into the category of no big whoop. the journeyman efforts of a professional magician. I had the sense that I had seen both tricks before. And Delgado himself is an oddly clumsy figure. He's an unstylish man in a tired body that seems to sag with the weight of his story. His suit accentuates this general impression. The sleeves are badly attached to the shoulders, where little valleys of fabric descend from the seams. He needed either a better tailor or an excellent dry cleaner. If you are accustomed to the look of professional performers, you might meditate for a moment on Delgado's face, which is flat and inert, like a bowl of pudding. And at the risk of going entirely too far, his fingers are slow and soft and inelegant. A card trick depends on the crispness of its execution. Delgado has a hard time truing up the edges of the cards where everything remains just the littlest bit out of line. But then suddenly, he hits his groove. He begins by telling a very complicated story. His parents marry. His father walks out, never looking back at his infant son. His mother discovers her lesbian self and invites another woman into the family. And Derek Delgado is left to cope. No one else in the neighborhood has two mommies like Derek. And someone throws that brick through his window. He tries mightily to keep the family's secret, but it bleeds out into the world, destroying his relationships with other children in the neighborhood who cannot tolerate the differentness of his family. This is 1972. A lesbian mother would have complicated my life also. Derek Delgado knows all about loneliness. But all the while, during the story of his pariahhood, he is busy with his toolkit, the marvels of the magician. He has no magic bowls from Mesopotamia, no encrusted idol from rural Mali. He climbs a ladder on the wall behind him and begins to pull sealed letters from their cubbyholes. It looks like he's doing all of this at random, but there must be a pattern which we can't discern. He descends the ladder with a wad of letters and calls someone down to sit on the stage. And here is where things get really interesting. Each night, there is only one single volunteer, but the recorded version of the performance puts several together. So it looks like there's a parade of letter choosers. Delgado displays the wad in his hand, and the letter choosers pick only one from the cluster. Sometimes tremblingly, sometimes confidently, they open the letter and read it silently. And then, almost invariably, they begin to cry. Because the letter, miraculously, is from someone they know who writes with a mix of admiration and mercy and profound understanding and tender love. The message is unmistakably personal. We know because Delgado has his volunteers read aloud, and the letters refer to the choosers with rich particularity. Dearest Father, my dear best friend, I love you, dear daughter, and I will never let you go. It's as if the hand of God descends from heaven to cradle the letter reader in a divine embrace. The deep loneliness is swept away in a moment of communion and understanding. You can see the impact on the face of the reader who appears to feel known and understood and embraced. The effect is a moment of powerful magic. The idol comes to life. The bowl glows with healing. Derek Delgado achieves deep humanity. it's the moment that all of us hope for in our lives, and you see it played out on the stage before you. It feels like the magic of human transformation, of somebody moving out of profound isolation, out of the sorrow and separateness of our lonely lives, into an instance of deep communion. The result is the only love that sustains us, a luminary experience that makes the fragments cohere. I know because I have been there myself. Human loneliness is 10 plagues in one. It's a national malady, a curse of its own. And everything has gotten worse in this pandemic. The fear is worse, the isolation is worse, along with the terrible sense that we are in this alone. Many pictures will be used to illustrate this period, but the one that nails it for me is Judy's shape in Kirkland, Washington. She sits behind the window in her nursing home while her daughter and son-in-law squat in the bushes outside. You've seen it. They are all holding cell phones, trying to make eye contact, and doing the best they can under the circumstances. And you can see immediately that they are miserably isolated. Judy looks like a fish in an aquarium, but a fish with COVID-19 who may not survive. I hope that she is alive to tell the story. But there are other kinds of loneliness too. Chronic illness, failure to connect. Long before COVID, long before Tulsa, I could barely endure the loneliness of my life. This was decades before Alice, decades before children, decades before the shape in which my own life is now settled. I was in love with a woman who did not love me back. For 11 years, I held on to a dream that never yielded to the fact that she did not love me. It spoiled all the pleasures that were offered along the way, all of the opportunities that sprang from my garden. It was my own obsessionalism that did me in, my all-or-nothing ideas about my life. But that didn't make the experience less painful. Here's the picture I want you to imagine. I returned to my room after her final visit. I sit down at my desk and weep convulsively. It took 2 full years before the pain abated. It was an ocean of loneliness as big as my heart. Ich hab gewen allein wie ein Stein. In the phrase of our people, I was as alone as a stone. And sometimes I think that some of that loneliness still clings to me, that it's the common fate of human beings like us. It has nothing to do with that long ago love. If anything, it's been displaced by my life with Alice, the experience of being joined in love to another. But still, I go through periods of unease, either that or some moment of wrenching isolation. It happened to me almost 18 months ago at the beginning of the pandemic that is still with us this evening. Things were already bad enough. The pandemic was a crisis of drifting particles which brought back all my anxieties about invisible contamination. Into all of this came a spasm of fear, which I can barely think about, let alone describe this evening. Or if I told you, I would have to kill you. This kind of thing happens to everyone. But the loneliness was paralyzing, a crisis of immobility. I was up all night. I prayed like a yeshiva student. I felt locked in my body like a comatose soul who would never be returned to the land of the living. The saddest phrase I know in English is sometimes spoken by the children of the elderly, and it's he is all alone, his friends are dead. I felt like I was all alone and my friends were dead. I know that not everyone feels the way I do. There are times when I don't feel that way either. Not everything in my life is an existential crisis, and some periods of quiet are good for the soul. I should probably admit that part of me really likes Zoom, the realization that I can turn myself on and off. I have this deal with the movements of my mouth, especially the way my two jaws come together, which never really took to dental intervention. One day soon, before I die, I'm going to get it fixed for good. But it was a relief to monitor the way it all looked on the screen, to turn it this way and that way, and mostly to keep it out of sight. What I'm trying to say is that I like the alone time, and I will regret when all the barriers fall. I chose a public life as a private person, and I've had to reckon with the muchness of it all. But there's a difference between being alone and loneliness. And I really don't like the feeling that I am living apart. I want to know, and I want to be known. I once spoke about a person who did this magnificently. He was and remains one of my most powerful models. He knows who he is, and I won't embarrass him further. But he regularly sweeps away the scrim of loneliness in other people. Every good person copies him intuitively. They approach airline gate agents like long-lost friends. They treat supermarket checkout clerks like actual persons instead of conveyor belt automatons built for efficiency. They observe the cardinal rule that persons are persons and not things for our use. They ask questions and actually listen for the answers. And they open themselves vulnerably to the questions of others. Be that person for everyone around you. There is someone in your family who needs a call from you tomorrow. They need to know that you will actually spend time with them. They need to be in the middle of a conversation without feeling hustled to the inevitable goodbye. They need to designate the moment of exit, to feel in that call that they are not a burden, to feel that they are actually interesting to you. And you can do this. You can be the man that I have described tonight. You can be Derek Delgado for the people you care about. You can take the challenge of loneliness in hand and make an actual difference in the life of another person. And we can do the same as a synagogue. We have done so much work on this question this year, upping our game when it comes to connectedness, to giving people the sense that they are known by their own synagogue, to feeling that they are part of the synagogue family. That's what Cinephone was all about. A meandering call from a loving volunteer who called a person who might not get many calls and invited that someone into ongoing relationship. The report from the front was that this was really important. And it's clear that we have to do much more. It's as elementary as a bowl of soup and matzo balls. And I speak to myself as much as I speak to all of you. If we can't get cookies to people who need them, we don't really deserve to be a congregation. I want you to think of a synagogue as God's response to loneliness. Nothing in the Jewish world can match it, because people never accustom themselves to loneliness. Not once, not ever, not in my experience. It remains a human sinkhole, a terrifying emptiness. And that finally is what Derek the magician tells us. The very last trick in his 6 revelations has a long history in the performance of wonders. It's also a mainstay in the world of faith healing, in tent revivals, in so-called memory magic. There's a good explanation for how it's done, but I determined to forget it as soon as I read it. I sat down at my desk and put it out of mind. The mechanics are so much less interesting than the result. The trick has 2 deceptively simple parts. On the way into the theater, every member of the audience picks a card that somehow describes her. Some cards are warm, like a grandmother or a sermon giver. Some are awful, like a 0 or a nobody. Every description completes the phrase, I am. The ticket remains in the hand of the audience member, burning its message into the hand that holds it. At the end of the performance, Rabbi Delgado begins. He asks everyone who wishes to stand in place, and then he begins to guess at their cards. The audience is a mix of celebrities and commoners. When Bill Gates stands, Delgado calls him a leader, exactly the card Gates chose for himself. He calls the fashionista Tim Gunn a good Samaritan. Gunn puts a finger to his lips as they begin to tremble. Delgado has called out the truth of his life. It goes on and on for almost a quarter of an hour. In every case, Delgado is right, identifying the artist, the activist, the change maker. He calls out the renegade and the ghost and the thief. When the truth is too shattering to recite aloud, he whispers it intimately into the ear of the card holder. And in almost every case, the reaction is the same. Everyone must know that this is an elaborate trick, that it's an accomplished piece of memory work and stagecraft. It's the beautiful manipulation of an artist genius who knows what his audience is desperate to experience, the sense of being known and appreciated, of being held in the embrace of another human being who can say something about them, even if it's merely a word or a phrase. Leader, bandit, good Samaritan. They weep and they crumple. They hold their hands to their foreheads. They hide their eyes because it's all too much. Someone has actually addressed their inner truth and lifted the great burden of ultimate loneliness. I pray that we can do that for one another, not by means of magic or stagecraft, but by living with tenderness, devotion, and love, by living the life that God asks of all of us. Derek Delgado is a marvelous magician, but his real gift is understanding loneliness and his empathic commitment to lifting its terrible weight. We can do the same without magic or trickery, merely by forcing ourselves to see and to feel. Amen, amen. Ken yehi ratzon. So may it be the will of the living God.